If you couldn't guess already, based on my other videos, cloud rap is one of my favorite genres ever. The idea of taking these dreamlike ambient soundscapes and reworking them into hip-hop beats is a concept that not only sounds great on paper, but works extremely well in practice. This shift in production also demands for a creative approach to rapping, whether it's using a melodic flow to complement the instrumental, a surrealist approach to lyricism to be more psychedelic, or just soaking your voice in autotune for the sake of the aesthetic. There's no right or wrong way to do it. While this genre is relatively new in the grander scheme of hip-hop, being pioneered in the late 2000s by the likes of Clams Casino and the Bass God, this idea of taking hip-hop into a more atmospheric context goes back a little bit further. We could look at the early 90s and how certain records from the UK trip-hop scene and the New York ambient scene are almost reminiscent of cloud rap from an instrumental standpoint if you squint long and hard enough at them, or the mid to late 2000s when our old pal Viper invented the entire genre inarguably. But I want to talk about something that falls in between these two chronologically. It all started in the late 90s when an underground supergroup called Deep Puddle Dynamics, consisting of Soul and Alias from Live Poets, Slug from Atmosphere, and Doseone from Doseone, recorded an album together called The Taste of Rain, Why Kneel. It's a pretty solid record, combining catchy sample loops with a cartoonish personality, somewhat akin to the Hieroglyphics crew, but every label that they tried to show the record to probably refused to listen past the part where they all sang Row 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 Your Boat. Because Row 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 Your Boat was too deep for mainstream audiences, everybody from the group, besides Slug, was inspired to start their own label to distribute the record themselves. The three MCs, as well as producers Gel and Nosdam, who did some work for Deep Puddle, gradually moved out to California alongside rappers Pedestrian and Y with help from their manager Bailey Parker. Together, they all founded the experimental hip-hop label Anticon in 1998, where they would not only go on to sign artists such as Sage Francis and Telephone Jim Jesus, but make frequent collaborative projects amongst each other. Some notable examples include Gel and Doseone's Them, which feels like a slightly more modern version of Deep Puddle, and 13 and God, which sees them collaborating with German indie band The Notwist to make a cool fusion of hip-hop and 2000s indie pop. However, oddly enough, some of these collaborations actually weren't put out on Anticon at all, like So-Called Artists, a group consisting of Soul, Alias, and DJ Mayonnaise, who had already put out music on Anticon, releasing an album on Mush Records. The same label would also house a series of 10-inch double A-side singles created by the collaborative efforts of Doseone, Y, and Nosdam under the name cLOUDDEAD, released throughout 2000 and 2001. All of these singles would then be combined into their now famous self-titled album, and the rest is history. While Anticon hasn't been that active for the past couple of years, they did manage to sign some pretty relevant artists in the 2010s, like Tobacco, Baths, and even Young Fathers for their first few mixtapes. The members of cLOUDDEAD are still putting in work too, with records from Y and Nosdam coming out as recently as this year, and Doseone doing soundtracks for indie games like Gang Beasts and Enter the Gungeon. The amount of music that each of these guys have made in different groups is probably too much for me to cover in one video, but some other notable projects include Greenthink, which sees Y and Doseone experimenting with unconventional samples and song structuring a couple of years before cLOUDDEAD became a thing, and Reaching Quiet, which feels more like an odd collage of sounds akin to a band like Negative Land than anything hip-hop related. As interesting as all of these projects are, I don't think that anything else that these guys made quite stacks up to the ambition and creativity that they were able to capture with cLOUDDEAD. It feels like a culmination of all of the cool ideas from projects like Deep Puddle and Greenthink, fine-tuned into a more digestible yet still wild as hell package. As I was saying earlier, their self-titled album is a compilation of 6 10-inch singles that they had released prior, adding up to a 12-track album made up of 6 two-part songs. However, because of the way these tracks are structured, it isn't really that noticeable that these songs are split into two halves to begin with. That's not to say they don't stand on their own or have a strong identity from one another, as they certainly do, but they each cover a ton of different musical ground, making for an unpredictable and dreamlike experience. It opens up with about a minute of droning ambience that acts as an overture to the unique production style and unconventional structure, before a subtle beat kicks in with some steady snares and a psychedelic synth line. Dose then begins his verse, and while the lyrics are delivered in a way that resembles rapping, it reads more as a cross between singing and slam poetry.
Inside my lips and I'll write betterment in the world. Wish I fall off, growing distant
I often hear people say that the vocal delivery on this album is kind of pretentious and artsy for the sake of being artsy, and while I definitely understand that point of view, I think it acts as a cool vehicle for storytelling. The way that Dose stretches out and repeats certain words to separate different lyrical ideas not only matches the slow melody that carries the beat, but gives his words even more meaning. These opening bars, when taken at face value, are about the anxieties of keeping a relationship and knowing the right words to say to prevent it from falling apart. But you could also take the she that is referred to as his own inner psyche telling him what lyrics to write. Y's flows are a little more conventional, as it sounds more like how you'd expect somebody to rap over a beat that's this slow and dreamy, but it does a lot to complement his lyrical style. Where Dose likes to experiment with the placement of his words and how his own cadence can be used to emphasize certain ideas, Y is a bit more straightforward in his methods of surrealist imagery. It's like every bar bleeds into one another from a lyrical standpoint in a somewhat stream of consciousness way, yet is still grounded by the idea that started it. He begins his verse by saying there's something to the fading of faith, as if he's getting older and losing touch with his past self, and then continues to play with this idea by contrasting imagery associated with childhood versus adulthood. He then uses this to express his own regrets, and maybe why his own faith has been fading over the years, coming close to finding a light at the end of the tunnel, but never quite reaching that point. Both of their verses are then summarized by these lines, with Dose speaking on the spontaneity of his process, and Y continuing to elaborate on his fading faith. It's also at this point that the thematic ties between these two verses are more prevalent, as they both deal with moving forward in life and conquering things without prior preparation. Dose then elaborates on this more with imagery of cave drawings, implying both a childlike sense of artistry and a time that feels far in the past, and loafers and a checkbook, which are boring things that adults use. This track, and really the entire album, has somewhat of a meta edge to it, with many of the lyrics directly referring to the artistic process of making the music that you are currently listening to. It's especially emphasized later on this song with this little section right here, as well as the guest verse from Logic, which in retrospect is an even more unfortunate rap name than Aesop Rock. Right before his verse kicks in, the beat switches to this bassier and more hard-hitting groove that still manages to keep the same psychedelic atmosphere intact. Logic's verse speaks on his own change in perspective on the world, which not only feels like a nod to the music itself changing right before he gives his verse, but also plays into the song's themes of moving forward, both from an artistic perspective and in life itself. Dose then continues this in a self-reflective verse delivered in his trademark style, before Y ends the track with these cool bars about living in a record, emphasizing the linkage between music and life found in the lyrics. He then wraps things up with this little verse, and that's pretty much the first track. The way these lyrics are delivered in context of the trippy production makes for some of the most intoxicating hip-hop of the 2000s, and nearly a decade before artists who we now know as the pioneers of cloud rap made their debut. Now, whether or not cLOUDDEAD is actually cloud rap is a pretty heated debate in music circles. You could argue that they have more in common with the ambient scene and downtempo electronic music than they do cloud rap, but I think the way that tracks like Apartment 1 and 2, Jimmy Breeze 2, and the various passages from other cuts combine hip-hop with these ethereal lo-fi soundscapes, at the very least feels like a precursor to the subgenre. Hell, the first of the 10 inches, which make up the first two tracks, feel more like cloud rap than maybe anything else on the album, despite being released the earliest. This is especially true on the second track, with its airy synths and slowed down chord progression that show up on the instrumentals. While the linkage between this song and its A-side counterpart feels kind of loose, I do detect similar themes of creating art and what their process is like, as well as the way it dictates how they live, not to mention the similarities in production choices. The track starts to wrap up with Y repeating the lines "same old hat, big difference," which to me seems like a reference to these two songs taking up different sides of the same record. The very last line is the apartment address of where the record was written, which perfectly sums up both of these tracks, as it not only gives meaning to the title, but makes it easier to picture a group of independent artists expressing the craft in a very oddball way. The dreamlike sense of structure that stems from the somewhat non sequitur lyrics, changes in flow, and frequent beat switch-ups is explored even more thoroughly on the second single, And All You Can Do Is Laugh. The first part of the song sets it up as a commentary on the working class using their limited resources to painfully crawl their way up in a system that makes the rich richer and the poor poorer. At least that's what I think It's McDonald's versus a handful of dry sea monkeys awaiting the wet sponge face smack domino vampire infection mark means. I mean, I don't know, all I can do is laugh. The beat then changes from this trippy white noise that barely resembles a rap beat at all to one of the most genuinely catchy moments on the record, combining a melodic percussion lead with these fizzling strung out synths and well-resonating bass drums to make it sound dense yet playful. The rap flows, despite feeling a little all over the place, breathe even more life into this instrumental and make for one of my my favorite moments on the record. The lyrical theme of the working class being the sole factor that keeps the rich where they are is continued as well with these lines from Dose that state how difficult it is to move up and how society hides its flaws, with Y giving a short set of bars that say something similar in a completely different way. We then get this interesting line asking should the rules by which a desert cactus lives be adopted by a sycamore as well, which I like to view as a metaphor that emphasizes the completely different lives that are held by these different economic classes. The whole track could also be about artistry and the disparity between independent artists who think outside the box but don't make any money, and mainstream artists who do the same thing over and over and make a ton of money, but that all depends on how cynical you want to be. After this is one of the most iconic moments on the entire record, where the two MCs list a bunch of US presidents who are now quote-unquote underground, and I see the meaning behind this as no matter how powerful you're able to become in your life, you're gonna spend most of your time buried, so it doesn't matter anyway. This is emphasized even more by this sample from the 1973 film Electric Eyed and Blue, stating that most of what we do is unimportant. The beat then changes again to this eerier and slowed down tempo that reminds me of something from the ambient scene, and the track pretty much ends. The second part of this song is pretty much just an instrumental with some vocals coming through in the samples, kind of like the instrumental tracks you'd hear on an MF Doom record, only much more echoey and progressive. After this is maybe my favorite track on the album, I Promise to Never Get Paint on My Glasses Again, which is another example of something that could be argued as proto-cloud rap. The faint piano chords, distant horns, and atmospheric synthesizers turn each section into its own musical dreamscape that hadn't really been explored in hip-hop prior. That is, if you even want to call this track hip-hop to begin with, as it's such a massive deconstruction of the genre with its barely sensical yet somewhat melodic flows and beats that, while steady, don't abide by the same snare patterns you'd expect from a late 90s or even an early 2000s rap beat. In fact, the drums are buried pretty deep in the mix, yet it somehow doesn't make these beats any less punchy or rhythmically sound. The lyrics seem to be a bit more personal, as Dose tackles the song mostly by himself with a few guest vocals from fellow Anticon founder Soul. It reads as a reflection of Dose being treated as an outsider amongst many of the people he grew up around, and how he takes solace in making art and consuming it. Later in the song, Soul and Dose go back and forth continuing to speak on this topic, with some interesting wordplay, especially from Soul. The song closes out with one of the catchiest moments on the record, where the two repeatedly sing this hook.
It's all the same shit, but they call it cLOUDDEAD. I only got 2 hands and half a head.
I don't know exactly what the meaning behind this is, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's probably a reference to the fact that Soul and Dose have collaborated before in a similar style, and now they're doing it again, but on a record called cLOUDDEAD. 2 hands and half a head could refer to the parts of their body that are required to write a song, as if they're so dedicated to their art that it's the only part of themselves that they need. While I would love to analyze the meaning of the song's second part, I genuinely cannot find the lyrics to it anywhere online, and I certainly can't make them out. I mean, have you heard this track? This is one of the more low-key and ambient cuts on the album, with quiet vocals and softer instrumentation, but it does kind of build up in the end with this weird vocal collage that I still can't quite make out, but I find it interesting nonetheless. Jimmy Breeze is another introspective cut, akin to the first part of I Promise, this time being told from the perspective of Y. It starts off with a prank phone call asking a person named Jimmy Breeze to be the rhythm guitar player in their band before dissing him behind his back, establishing a self-reflective sense of superstition. Y then gives his verse, in which he explains the tolerance he's built up after being made fun of as a kid, and even has a small nod to the previous track. The hook continues to speak on this with self-deprecating yet interesting imagery, summing up his own shortcomings and social skills. The beat fits thematically as well, with its leading synthesizers sounding like a rearranged version of a digital ringtone. The rest of the track is taken up by these ambient droning soundscapes that eventually unfold into these angelic vocals that are pretty captivating. It acts as a great segue into the song's second side, which begins with a similarly airy sound. In fact, I'd argue that the beat that takes up the first minute and a half of this track is one of the most straightforward examples of proto-cloud rap on the record, with its boom bap cadence and melodic accompaniment. I know that some people may argue against the idea of a boom bap inspired beat being proto-cloud rap, but I'm more concerned with the overall vibe and aesthetic of the instrumental than strictly the rhythm. The verses on this song read to me as the physical and mental toll that can weigh on someone whose life revolves too heavily around creating art. This also explains the hook, which is not only one of the most memorable moments on the the album from a musical standpoint, but creatively communicates the feeling of fatigue found in the verses. The ram's crumpled horn and empty turtle shell refer to parts of an animal that take longer to decompose after the animal has passed away, like how artists leave behind their art for people to consume after they die. Sunset as an all-day process could be looked at as a metaphor referring to the inevitability of death, but I like to see it as a reference to the daily routine of creating art and how art itself reflects reality. The rest of the track is taken up by this more mysterious instrumental that still manages to be pretty catchy, playing off of the second verse in a way that shows this topic in a darker light. It actually transitions pretty smoothly into CLOUDDEAD number 5, which is an entirely instrumental track throughout both of its parts, feeling like a continuation of the dying artist themes that were on the previous track. The song's A-side is mostly eerie and hopeless, with some interesting song progressions and details thrown in, like the faint background vocals that show up around 3/4 into the track. In its final moments, the drums kick in and we get a genuinely epic payoff with these ambient synths that are beautifully morphed into an interesting lead. The second part carries this vibe, with a drone that feels like one continuous crescendo, eventually turning into a collage of ambient rap beats that carry the track. We're then greeted with the final single on the record, Bike, which is genuinely a banger at times. The first beat on this song has these hard-hitting snares that are well complemented by the hazy yet cohesive horns and quick rap flows. It's a celebratory moment where the group sounds happy about finally finishing the piece of art that they were working on, being this album, and even calls back to the paint on my glasses motif, stating that they are now fixed. There's a weird moment after this section where we get a verse from both of the members, but you really can't make out what they're saying because the vocals are reversed. Reading these lyrics online though, they seem to be more bars about celebrating artistry and the love for the craft that these guys make. I view the decision to reverse these lyrics as being symbolic of how that joy can be difficult to hold on to and comprehend, as well as the continuous cycle of creation when you have to make art for a living. The end of this verse also gives us the physics of a bicycle line that shows up later in the track, which could be another reference to the repetitive cycle of day-to-day life and how tedious it can be to make a living, even if you're doing something that's creatively fulfilling. This could also have something to do with the lyrics about the dead dog on the shoulder of 71 that shows up on the eventual hook, but I've never been able to really decipher these particular lyrics, even though they are referred to again on another track from CLOUDDEAD's next album, which we'll get to in a second. And alas, we've reached the final track, Bike 2. What amazing lyrics, musical passages, and rap flows can we expect to hear here? Oh, the lyrics aren't online? Well, that's kind of anticlimactic. Truth be told though, some of the lyrics from this song are actually just repeated from part 1, including the intro performed as an a cappella, and the outro, which reincorporates the physics of a bicycle line. It's another trippy, experimental rap joint that falls in line with how the rest of the record sounds, yet is still able to be pretty unpredictable, wrapping up the album on a bittersweet note. And with that, we have CLOUDDEAD Self-Titled, an underground cult classic that pushed hip-hop into an ethereal, psychedelic direction that very few records had quite done at the time. Whether or not it fits into the cloud rap genre kind of depends on how you want to define it and how much you're willing to ignore the fact that the word cloud is in the title. Again, you could label it more as an ambient-inspired experimental rap record than anything cloud rap related, as I don't think that the eventual pioneers of the genre have listed it as an influence or anything like that. But regardless of how you want to categorize it, it's one of the strangest and most dense rap records to come out of the 2000s, and I really can't get enough of it. This was also kind of a breakout project for the group, as it quickly became the most talked about thing that any of the members had been involved with up until that point, with even the 10-inch singles selling out relatively quickly. The following year, they released another single with two completely different songs on it, being The Sound of a Handshake and This About the City. The first of which is a commentary on how artists get screwed over in the music industry, and has this cool section where one of the members is singing this catchy hook that sounds friendly and inviting, while the other one is subtly saying what's really going on. Following this is another section that's hard to make out without having the lyrics in front of you, and I like to think that this is intentional given the song's topic of the dangers of the music industry not being super apparent from the outside. We get a list of all of the places that the money made by the artist goes to besides the actual artist themselves in a pretty comical way. It's all done over a bass-heavy electronic instrumental that complements the flows quite nicely. The B-side is taken up by This About the City, which is about the group riding the bus around the city and all of the kooky shenanigans that they saw while on the ride. It may be the most straightforward cLOUDDEAD song I've heard from a topical standpoint, but fits in line with the group's overall style. The group would then release a single a couple of years later called Dead Dogs 2, which is a possible reference to these lyrics that were on the track Bite. There's a lot of interesting things about this song, like the lyrics about dead dogs coming to life, and the fact that the legendary IDM duo Boards of Canada made a remix of the song right there on the single's B-side, but what I find most fascinating is it sounds like it had a budget behind it. Compared to the self-titled and the single that came after that, this song doesn't sound lo-fi or even all that abstract from a compositional standpoint. It goes by a more conventional verse-chorus structure, the rap flows aren't as heady, and the beat doesn't really undergo any huge changes throughout its 4-minute runtime. I will say that the Boards of Canada remix is substantially better than the original just for how much more meat it adds to the beat, but overall it's a pretty big departure from how we've known cLOUDDEAD to sound. That's not to say they've completely sold out or anything like that, as the oddball charm of the group is still left intact, but it comes across as somewhat of an awkward middle ground between a conventional and abstract sound. On the back of the single art we see a message that says this is cLOUDDEAD 9 of 10, and I'm assuming that 1 through 6 were the original 10 inches, 7 was the compilation of all of them, and 8 was the single released after that. Shortly after Dead Dogs 2 came out, we got their first official album 10 in 2004, and I don't like this one nearly as much as the self-titled. I guess a lot of my problems with it are the same problems that I had with the Dead Dog single, and that it feels disappointingly unambitious. The songs in general are much shorter and more hook-driven, and the mellowed-out psychedelia is pretty much entirely gone in favor of a more synthetic and to-the-point sound. Now, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with this decision. In fact, on paper, I think it sounds like it could have been an interesting change of pace, especially considering the abstract freakishness of the self-titled is still very much present on this record. But it's more the execution that I have a problem with. Rather than having the sample detours, beat switch-ups, and weird vocal inflections feel like an extension of the free-flowing and dreamlike sense of structure, the higher production value and hookier songs just make them kind of annoying for me on here. Take the Key and Teen Skip for example, a song that starts with a sparse beat that uses a very short vocal sample, and eventually gets more and more hectic as the track goes on. The way the layers of instrumentation are piled on top of one another in context of the verses just feels really haphazard and awkward when paired with the more cleaned up production. Or the track Son of a Gun, which presents some kind of interesting commentary on gun control that gets constantly interrupted by these obnoxious vocal crescendos that are more distracting than they are effective. The album definitely has a self-aware edge to it. I mean, the first song is literally called Pop Song and has some well-written bars about how celebrities completely sacrifice themselves for the public eye, but the way the group tries to fit in all of their abstract tendencies into these songs that don't really call for them makes it feel kind of disjointed. Now, that's not to say there's no good tracks here. I think Rhymer's Only Room has a very memorable vocal melody and a beat that makes me feel like I'm sitting right there alongside these artists and watching their process unfold. And 320, despite mostly being an instrumental, has probably the most effective and well-executed song progression on the record. The album overall isn't bad by any means, but it ironically feels much more disjointed and confused than its predecessor despite its more straightforward approach. After this, the group members all went off and continued to do their own thing in the Anticon label, with Dose leaving this statement in an interview that's pretty interesting. I'd recommend pausing and reading through it. With that, we have cLOUDDEAD, the bizarre group that took elements of hip-hop and completely reworked them into something entirely different. Let me know your thoughts on this group. Do you think that they predicted the whole cloud rap wave with their music, or are they just part of the natural progression of experimental hip-hop? Thank you all so much for watching, and if you enjoyed, you know the drill.
When I get home, my sorrow will be over.